Hello there and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show where we track the changes happening to our world right now and challenge those coming up with the solutions. President Biden has pledged to double the $5.7 billion that the US had already committed to help developing countries cope with climate change. Mr. Biden made the announcement at the United Nations General Assembly in New York, where he warned we had entered a decisive decade for our world. His intervention came after Boris Johnson called on rich nations to make good their promise to support poorer countries in their fight against climate change. Well, coming up, we'll look at whether the US pledge could help make November's COP26 summit in Glasgow a success. But first, let's hear what Mr. Biden had to say this afternoon.
In April, I announced the United States will double our public international financing to help developing nations tackle the climate crisis. And today, I'm proud to announce that we'll work with the Congress to double that number again, including for adaptation efforts. This will make the United States a leader in public climate finance, and with our added support, together with increased private capital and from other donors, we'll be able to meet the goal of mobilizing $100 billion to support climate action in developing nations.
President Biden speaking a short time ago. Well, our climate change correspondent Hannah Thomas-Peter explains just why the funding increase could prove so important.
The United Nations General Assembly in New York is an important staging post on the way to the COP26 Climate Change Summit, which is being held in Glasgow later this year. At the summit, we're told the focus will be on coal, cars, cash and trees, and today it's cash in the spotlight. That's because back in 2009, rich countries pledged to give $100 billion per year from 2020 to support poorer nations as they adapt to the effects of climate change. But that target has been missed. The most recent OECD report estimates that only $79.6 billion in public and private funding has been delivered so far. America had taken some of the blame for that, promising just $5.7 billion a year, which critics said was nowhere near enough given the size of its economy. But now, America has promised to double its annual contribution to over $11 billion, potentially encouraging other nations who might have been holding back to do the same. The US now joins the UK, which has pledged to deliver around $3 billion a year over the next 5 years as a leader in climate finance funding. So why does all of this matter so much? Well, the COP26 climate meeting is just weeks away now, and developing countries like Indonesia and others have said they are willing to consider tougher carbon emissions targets, but only if they are funded as promised. To them, it's a matter of trust and good faith. It may be just a number, but that $100 billion really matters.
So after his address to the UN in New York, Mr. Biden is now back at the White House, where he's due to welcome Boris Johnson this evening. In the past few minutes, he's been reacting to Mr. Biden's pledge.
This is very good news in the sense that the United States has stepped up to the plate with a massive contribution, a very substantial contribution, $11.2 billion, I think it is, and that's a very, very good start. It means that we're a long way towards the goal that we need to achieve, but there's still further to go. And there are still countries around the world that will be looking to us in the developed world to support them as they make the transition to low-carbon technologies to fight climate change. But there's no question that this American action today has been a big lift and will really help us to get there.
Well, our US correspondent, Martha Kellner, is in Washington for us now. Martha, Boris Johnson, they're very buoyant. How much credit do you think he can take for this announcement by Joe Biden ahead of COP26?
I think he'll certainly try to frame this as a major victory for the UK and for his personal lobbying on climate change ahead of the COP26 conference, which is viewed as a home conference in the UK in Glasgow in November. He's described it as a moment of truth for the world on climate change. And he's also been urging for some time for major economies and those major emitters of carbon to take the lead on this. And he's got this result, as he'll frame it, from President Biden committing to double the amount that America is giving to developing countries as they fight climate change too, from just under $6 billion to just under $12 billion. President Biden, incredibly impassioned about climate during that speech. He said it was a decade that will quite literally determine our future. He said, will we suffer a merciless march of ever-worsening droughts and floods, more intense fires and hurricanes, longer heat waves and rising seas? He now has to convince a domestic audience that human fault is a result of climate change, is the cause of climate change. Apologies.
OK, Martha, in Washington, thank you. Well, joining me now is Tuna, climate envoy of the Marshall Islands. The US Geological Survey has forecast that some of the islands will be submerged by 2035. So, Tina, tell me your reaction to this huge announcement by the president.
Yes, I watched that speech like a hawk, and I just have to say I breathed a huge sigh of relief, and I was energized because this announcement is significant. It gets us so much closer to where we need to be, and I just think we now have some momentum in the next few weeks going forward to COP.
So tell me, how will this money be spent somewhere like the Marshall Islands?
In the Marshall Islands, we've taken a leadership role in submitting higher emissions targets, and we have plans in place for how to do that. We have an electricity roadmap to transition us to renewable energies, but that roadmap is not at this moment funded. And we've been working hard to get that funding. And this kind of pledge signals that, we're in this together, that not just the US, but donor countries in general, they have our back. And we can only meet this crisis, with a global response.
We're looking at some of the images of the Marshall Islands. You really are at the front line of climate change, aren't you? Give me a sense of how difficult things there are right now.
It has been a very, very difficult year and a half, 2 years, particularly with COVID and the restrictions on travel and the economic difficulties posed by shutdowns, and having to manage both COVID and the climate crisis at the same time. It's really a textbook example of sort of the cascading effects of these crises. And so seeing that countries like the United States and others are willing to step up and join hands with us to really respond gives us, hope for the future.
OK, Tina Steggy, great to have you with us. Many thanks.
Thank you.
And we'll be discussing if $100 billion is enough for developing countries to take real action on climate change. Today, I'm joined by the travel writer Juliet Kinsman and George Monbiot from The Guardian. That's coming up in a few minutes' time. Now, in some of today's other climate news, the government has reached an agreement with CF Industries to restart CO2 production. The US fertiliser company, which is one of just two main CO2 suppliers to the UK, has suspended operations because of the high cost of energy, leading to a national shortage. Greenhouse gas emissions fell by 13% in the UK last year. It's the largest drop since records began. Data from the Office of National Statistics shows overall emissions dropped by around 72 million tonnes between 2019 and 2020 as people stayed at home during the pandemic. The transport sector, perhaps unsurprisingly, was the biggest driver of falling emissions with a record 40% decline. And MPs are recommending that washing machines should be fitted with filters which can catch microplastic fibres from clothes. A new all-party parliamentary group has been set up to look at the environmental harm caused by those tiny fragments. It wants to see new rules requiring manufacturers to fit the filters from 2025. Now, scientists say one of the world's biggest and most expensive fish may have returned to UK waters because of rising sea temperatures. Atlantic bluefin tuna are now swimming off the southwest coast, more than half a century since they were last spotted. Now the government has recruited 15 fishermen to track the fish for a scientific study, which Sky's Dan Whitehead was given exclusive access to.
We're on, there we go. It's been 60 years since they last swam in our waters. Now Atlantic bluefin tuna are back in such numbers that government scientists are working with Cornish fishermen to find out why.
We need to know what's going on, we need to know the numbers, we need to know where they are, how many are there, the age structure, as much as we can get really.
Catching bluefin tuna is banned in the UK, but this study is giving recreational anglers the opportunity to finally reel one in.
It's the first time I've ever caught a bluefin tuna, yeah.
How's it feel?
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. To do it in British waters, it's something I thought I'd never do.
A little bit of port, please, Chris.
The fish are tagged before being released. Getting the study to this stage has seen fishermen go back to the classroom. They've been trained by government scientists in how to safely handle the fish. The study runs till November, with the hope that tags will provide answers as to why they've returned.
So one of the factors could be climate factors, so increased water temperatures, it could be an increase in the numbers and distribution of the bait fish which they predate upon, or other factors that are as yet unknown.
This is citizen science in action. Fishermen working alongside government teams to track this magnificent fish. But the return of Atlantic bluefin tuna to UK waters could also provide a new lifeline for Cornwall's communities.
70, 73.
Unlike other countries, the UK doesn't have a commercial or recreational quota to catch bluefin tuna. Skippers hope this study could change that if this huge fish is back in the southwest for good. Dan Whitehead, Sky News in Cornwall.
Some good news for once. Well, do stay with us. Coming up after the break, we're going to be discussing, is $100 billion enough money for developing countries, and whether Insulate Britain's protests are working. I'm going to be joined by travel writer Juliet Kinsman and Guardian columnist George Monbiot. That's coming up in a couple of minutes.
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world. If there is a bigger explosion, this area would be in the danger zone.
These traffic jams snake for hours up and down this hillside. It means precious aid can't access those in need.
You can see the depth of the water. If you have a look in front of us, there are people wading through it.
I think experiencing the 2 million person march in Hong Kong, that was a moment.
I don't like the Chinese government. It's cruel.
It was real people power in action.
Police have been firing tear gas and rubber bullets.
see fires all around us here, and just one of them is the size of around 31,000 football pitches.
Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Bangkok.
We don't understand that every lake or a pond is a habitat in itself, which houses frogs, snakes, crabs, turtles, birds, so many different life forms. Human beings directly depend on underground water source. So a lake or a pond is necessary to replenish these groundwater resources.
Hello again, welcome back to the Daily Climate Show here on Sky News, and we're getting straight into discussing the climate issues of the day with the travel writer Juliet, Kinsman, and George Monbiot, environmentalist and Guardian columnist. There they are. Well, let's kick off with Joe Biden's pledge ahead of COP26 that the US will double the money it's making available to help developing countries cope with climate change. Very good evening to both of you. George, why don't we start with you first? I'm sure you heard the announcement. Great news, isn't it?
Well, sort of. I mean, finally, the government of the US is making good pledges, which are, what are they now, 12 years old? And to be honest, it scarcely touches the sides. I mean, this is a massive amount of investment required to help poorer nations. It also should represent just a small part of the huge climate debt which rich nations owe to the poor ones due to the impacts of our greenhouse gases.
Well, hang on a minute, George. Doubling climate finance to $11 billion. It's a huge amount of money. And it's good in the sense that it shows that the US is leading the way, but also that the UK is able to make a difference ahead of COP26.
Well, look, any increment in money is good, but it's still, I mean, it sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but it's tiny. I mean, really, really tiny. When you think of all the nations which are already suffering climate crises right now and are going to suffer much worse climate crises as a result primarily of the greenhouse gases that the rich nations have produced. So we did this to them. And this is a very small reparation by comparison, and also far too little money to actually help them out of the emergencies which we've landed on them.
Yeah. Juliet, let's get your thoughts on this. This is what President Biden said earlier. Let's remind ourselves. He said it's a chance for each of our countries to invest in ourselves and our own futures. Are you confident that this money, even if it's not enough, will be spent wisely and won't be frittered away?
Oh, my goodness, no way. I mean, it's already got shades of Austin Powers around it. You know, these huge just numbers said. What do they mean? Where are they going? Where is this money going? What's being done with it? What are the strings attached? Because, you know, however money circulates, generally, and certainly from the wealthy polluting countries, there are strings attached. They want to see return on investment. So I would love it a lot more if I could hear where that money was going. They were investing in the education of women in remote rural areas, which is actually tackling one of the biggest challenges causing the climate emergency. How people ask, you know, well, it tackles population situation. Women get married later. They have fewer, healthier children. They're better equipped to deal with extreme weather. They contribute better to the economy. So these are the kind of conversations I want to hear. And I also will get much more excited when I hear about the perpetrators, the polluters, instead of these gestures and giving money to the poorer countries, saying this is how we're bringing down our emissions, these are the numbers, and this is how we're doing better, instead of sort of trying to look
Juliet,
like
that leads very nicely on to my next question, actually. President Bolsonaro of Brazil, he said today, we do hope industrialised countries will actually fulfil their commitments to climate funding. I mean, Juliet, there's an irony there, isn't there, that he is lecturing the rest of us on how to tackle climate change?
Absolutely. Look, I don't want to hear about these pledges and these commitments. I just want to see the numbers of emissions being brought down from the industrialized ways of the wealthier countries, rather than this sort of atonement and whatever you want to call it, offsetting almost. We really want to understand how the causes of the climate emergency are being tackled.
OK, stay where you are, both of you. We're going to move on to another topic now. Insulate Britain. You may have seen this today. They block sections of the M25 for the 5th time in a week. And they say actions will continue until the government commits to insulating homes. But is this disruptive form of protest damaging their cause? Juliet, what do you think? Good thing, bad thing?
Well, so look, insulation is actually a topic close to my heart. 20% of emissions in the UK, greenhouse gas emissions, come from the warming of the places we live in and we work in. So it's an issue. So thank you. Yes, shine a light on it. When they first did this in August, the first protest,
OK, well, let's ask George then, because, George, this is what the police said today. Protesters have put their own lives, as well as those of others, at risk. I mean, stopping traffic on the M25 is hugely dangerous. It's a pretty stupid way to get your message out there, isn't it?
You have to draw attention to this issue, and civil disobedience is an essential way of doing so. It's been an essential protest tactic all the way through. The suffragettes, Gandhi, Martin Luther King. When you have an issue which is being comprehensively neglected by those in power, you have to use the most powerful means at your disposal to try to get it on the front page, in front of people's minds. And disruptive civil disobedience has time and again proved to be that most powerful means. And of course, it is inconvenient to people. But while we're talking about the inconvenience on the M25, just a couple of days ago, motorways in France were flooded, probably as a result of climate breakdown. And that took an awful lot longer to clear. And that is a glimpse of the future we're going to have repeatedly, unless we start to bring in the radical aims of Insulate Britain's calling for.
Juliet, like Gandhi, suffragettes?
Well, I just went to their website. There's no information on how I can actually insulate better. Give me some tools.
Oh, you mean on their website? You're not getting the information you need if you wanted to insulate? Yeah, OK. I get that. I get that point. I mean, George, I have to say, one person on the radio this morning was saying he was trying to drive his mother to hospital because she'd had a stroke. They got to hospital hours late, and as a result, she's partially paralysed.
Well, I'm really sorry to hear that. And, obviously, bad stuff does happen. But, we're facing disruption, which is going to be killing hundreds of millions of people unless we get a grip on this. This is huge. I mean, I don't think anyone really can get their head around the level of suffering which we're likely to experience unless we stop climate breakdown from happening. And it seems to me that the only people who are taking it seriously are protesters who are almost putting their lives on the line to try to draw attention to the massive neglect of this issue by those in power. And these protests would not be necessary if those in power were actually interested in saving lives and stopping the catastrophe which is coming our way.
OK, we're out of time. We could debate this much longer. But George, Juliet, always good to speak to you. Thank you very much indeed. And that's everything from us for today. On the show tomorrow, our activist Michaela Loach, also Tom Burke, director of the climate think tank E3G. But do stay tuned. Coming up next on Sky News tonight, we'll have more on President Biden's pledge to help build a stronger global community and coverage of his meeting with Boris Johnson. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.